Hello and welcome. Happy Friday. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm the owner and founder of Re+active Therapy and Wellness in the LA area, joining you live a couple times a week to share what we're learning and doing here with the world. And it has been Functional Neurologic Disorders Awareness Week. And I have been sharing a lot of what I've been reading and learning about functional neurologic disorders. So I'm really excited to share yet another study. This one really interesting, a lot of science in it, a lot of brain. So I actually brought my brain model to point out a few areas because we're going to be diving into some neuroanatomy here. So I'm going to highlight some of the key findings from an article, again, that was just published last week from a group in France, and it is called Association Between Brain Metabolism and Clinical Course of Motor Functional Neurologic Disorders. And if you are, it's in the journal Brain. And if you're on our newsletter, I will send out a link to all the articles, all the videos and resources that I've been talking about all week. I'll send those out. So you can join our email list either at reactiveeducation.com if you're a healthcare provider, or reactivept.com if you are a person with a neurologic disorder. So let's talk about this really interesting article. Um, excuse me. I'm going to give first some of the acronyms and go through the brain so that we can talk about them in a little shorthand. So first, often we'll say FND or FMD, FN as in Nancy, functional neurologic disorder, FM as in Mark, functional movement disorder, or also a motor version of a functional neurologic disorder. So in this study, they were really looking at motor dysfunction in functional neurologic disorders specifically. So that's one of them. Other parts of the brain, and I don't even have all of them on my brain model here, but some of the key components that they looked at from a brain metabolism standpoint first. So this is, let me see how I can hold this up and make sure that you can see it. Let me orient you to the brain model. So this is the front, this is the back. The front of the brain is also where your eyeballs are. They're connected directly to the brain. And this is the orbital frontal cortex, the part of the frontal lobe, the front of the brain, that is connected to our eyes, orbital frontal cortex, also called OFC in this particular article. Also in the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobes happen to be pretty important in everything, but in functional neurologic disorders. There's also a part called the DLPFC, dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. So front, prefrontal, dorsal, and lateral. I don't have it marked on here. I mostly have primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex, our cerebellum. You can see parietal and occipital lobes marked here. So I don't have everything marked on my brain model, all these fancy pieces. Supplementary motor area, also really important, also in the frontal lobe. So another part that helps drive movement, also called SMA. I think those are the biggest ones that I wanted to point out on here so that we kind of had a common language. So what were the authors looking at here? It's kind of a unique study, actually. I really haven't seen this done, but essentially they were using imaging, looking at the metabolism of glucose. So they do this through a PET scan, and they were looking at activity and metabolism in different parts of the brain in people who had just had their first episode. So this is a small group of people, 20 people to start out with, that they recruited over years, first episode of motor functional neurologic disorder. So not a large group of people. They were looking at them right away because what they wanted to see is if they had what they were calling state markers, meaning metabolism states in the brain that were correlated to them having their very first symptom. Then they actually followed them over time, over 3 months, did it again, and wanted to see if those state markers were correlated at all with recovery that people had. Here's the cool thing is that a lot of people had recovery during that time too. I think that says a lot about what's potential after somebody's first motor FND symptom is a lot of people can have recovery. So that's the overall gist of it. I want to give you a little bit of the background that they describe as well. Excuse me. This study really comes on the heels of many studies looking at changes in brain activity with people with motor FND. We have seen in the literature that there are brain circuits that are involved, the salience network, the network that underlies a monitoring action, self-agency, memory. A lot of these pieces have been implicated in the connectivity issue in FND and underlying key areas, which is why they actually looked at brain metabolism in these areas. So the anterior cingulate cortex, that orbital frontal cortex that I talked about, the OFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, and the temporal parietal junction, as well as other areas like the thalamus, the amygdala, the insula, and the motor areas like supplementary motor areas. So all of these have been shown to have changes in FND. So really important. So this is kind of following up on that. What exactly do we know when a person has their first symptom? And so that's precisely what they looked to do. So again, this is a small group of people just with their first symptom, and then they matched them to other people, age matched, gender matched, for comparison. So basically a control group. They had other people without neurologic disorders who also underwent PET scans in the same hospital system due to another reason, but not due to brain changes. So they started out with 20, I believe it was 14 people at Followup that they had. And what they were looking at is brain metabolism differences between FND and the control group, and then brain metabolism differences from the initial onset to 3 months, and then correlations of the metabolism with a person's function. So really interesting, again, looking to maybe look even for predictors of things, of recovery, right? Or of extent of disability. And also very interesting, I hadn't seen this done, but they use the EDSS and the NIH stroke scale as measurements, which typically I've seen those in MS or in stroke. So, but they are good ways to capture motor disability. So what did they find? So first, when they compared the resting state brain metabolism in people with FND and the controls, they found that the people with FND had a low resting state metabolism compared to controls in the frontal, both sides actually, frontal polar cortex, in the SMA on the left side and the right OFC, orbital frontal cortex. So definitely differences from people with FND to control. That has been seen in the literature, right? Something else really interesting, so just looking at the functional scores, clinical scores over the time, most of the people who followed up, so 8 of the 14 people showed improvement from their baseline to the 3 months. That's really encouraging to me. The other thing is that that even those people who had because they use the two measures, that not everybody who, gosh, how do I say this? Um, we have people that improved, the other people mostly remained stable, did not get worse. That I don't know why that took me so long to get out. Okay, so that's the resting metabolism and then looking at their functional scores over time. So then what about the 3-month follow-up? So here's what's really interesting. At 3-month follow-up, there wasn't really a difference in the resting state brain metabolism. Wow. Okay. So this is making their case that potentially that brain metabolism they saw initially was a state marker of that initial onset. That's really interesting to me. Then and that was compared with controls. Now, when they looked at people who did not improve, so remember, 8 people of the 14 improved, 6 people still had a persistent motor disability. The people who still, the people who had improvement according to those functional scales, had particular markers of brain metabolism. So again, they're trying to look for, what is it? Why did that person get better and why did that person not? Now, they didn't report, by the way, whether that person had therapy, because that could have been something too, but they did look at what were some of their differences in the brain. So they did find there was a high right PFDLC, or I usually say DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity, a high right orbital frontal cortex, and a bilateral frontal polar metabolism at 3 months. So those people who had improvement had greater activity in those areas. So very interesting that they found that. So by the way, in the article, they have some images of that. They have images showing the changes in functional scores too, really helpful. And again, if you're on our newsletter, I'll send out this a link to this article as well. So what's the summary there? So the results of the study revealed a resting state, potentially this marker of frontal hypo or decreased metabolism in the brain during the symptom onset, particularly in areas of motor control. No surprise there. So SMA, also emotional regulation. So that's our orbital frontal cortex. And those results remained unchanged for them. We also know, as I said, that increasing activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the right OFC, and bilateral frontal polar areas were indicative or consistent with patients who had improvement in their motor ability. Now, this is pretty consistent with prior studies looking at this in people with FND. So SMA areas, emotional regulation areas, the whole emotion regulation network may be implicated in that initial onset. So it really is, I think, again, this makes a very good case for understanding a person holistically, the motor control standpoint, the emotional piece, the responding to the environment, because it's the integration of those that seem to go awry in FND. And so for us to promote recovery, we want to improve the communication and connection in those particular areas. So I think this is really, really important. And as well as thinking about, well, what areas actually improved in people that had recovery and people that had improvement, could that also be something that we're targeting? Targeting things to drive um, regulation and connectivity um, and metabolism in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? For example, I don't know about you all, but one of the things that I do literally do as I'm thinking of a treatment plan or an idea or activity with a person is I think of the brain. Like, what do I want to light up with this? To be very specific. And so that's why I kind of love some of this imaging stuff, is that it really can gets to some of that neuroplasticity piece. Um, so um, there's so much in this article. If you look at my version of it, it's highlighted all over. But let me just summarize, right? So one we learn from this is there are differences in brain metabolism at rest, particularly in that first episode, and they include motor and emotion regulating areas. We also know that metabolism can improve in brain areas that underlie regulation of emotion and cognitive control, and this seems to correlate with improvement of the motor symptoms. So interesting. We should target that in treatment, right? And basically then that the metabolic level of all of these attentional brain networks at baseline is likely going to be a strong predictor of motor recovery. And I would say also highlights the need for us to have a neuro rehab approach that targets those areas of the brain. So very interesting. So again, it's been FND Awareness Month. I've been talking about this all month, and I've got it in our newsletter. You can get that at reactiveeducation.com or reactivept.com. And because it's Functional Neurologic Disorders Awareness Month, I put together years of our resources that we've created for people with functional movement disorders, for healthcare providers to help guide the pathway of, if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed of where to start with somebody, we've got resources. So I put it into a download so you can get it all together. It's a whole bundle of things. It includes our free webinar, an assessment cheat sheet, treatment cheat sheets, even audio recordings for autonomic practice. So I highly recommend you get that. I'll put a link here for you so that you can download that. And thank you so much for joining me today. And as we journey and learn together, your questions, your interest, your curiosity has really driven me. So I just want to thank you for that. And send me questions. You can put things in the comments here. You can email us. I really love hearing from you, and we'll keep responding with a Q&A. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend.